I'm often asked, what is psychological trauma and how do I know if I've had it? So many people have asked me, how do you get trauma? What is it? And so in this episode, we'll take a deeper look at what psychological trauma is, and I'll offer a non exhaustive list of the many experiences that cause us trauma. It's important to understand it in order to understand your mental health. Stay tuned for more on this episode of Minding Your Amygdala, a brain body and behavior podcast. Hey, creators. Welcome to Minding Your Amygdala, the brain, body, and behavior podcast, where you'll learn to awaken to your emotions, get informed about your biology, and motivated to use skills to improve your mental health. I'm your host, Dr. Lana, America's one and only trauma psychiatrist. Do you recognize the critical importance of emotions and mental health? Do you want to know more about how to self-recover from trauma? Do you want to better understand the updated science about how our brain and body shapes our behaviors? If you answered yes to any of these questions, then you're in the right place. This podcast is focused on making complex brain science simple and usable. You'll learn the 6 primitive brain systems predictably programmed by trauma and empathy skills practice, my unique methodology that can help you improve your own thoughts, emotions, and actions. I'm the Skills Over Pills doc, but I'm also a mama 3, a busy entrepreneur, and a human being trying to make it through multiple global pandemics just like you. Minding Your Amygdala will teach you transformative ways that you can approach your day-to-day life, and I'll give you strategies to break free from the trauma cycle. All right, let's get started. Hey, y'all. Welcome to another episode of Minding Your Amygdala, a brain, body, and behavior podcast with me, Dr. Lana, trauma psychiatrist. Now, this is one of my favorite subjects, so once again, I will try not to get carried away. But I just love talking about trauma. And I know that may sound incredibly strange. Why would anybody like to talk about trauma? Well, I didn't always feel this way about it. And if you've listened to any of the previous episodes, you have heard my story about how I came to this deeper understanding of psychological trauma. But it was a process that occurred over a number of years. So the good news is that I get to give you the short version of this. So this episode is called Trauma Hurts because my motto for my business is trauma hurts, empathy heals. And I thought long and hard about what I wanted my catchphrase to be. And I wanted to make it as short and sweet and simple as possible. One of the things that I learned in the process of problem solving is that the first step of problem solving is to actually identify the problem. Well. We have a bit of an issue with admitting trauma to ourselves and to other people. Trauma is one of the biggest blind spots we have in society right now. And hopefully once you get through this episode, you'll understand why I say that. Psychological trauma is something that every single human being on earth will experience, has experienced, is currently experiencing. Psychological trauma is baked into the fabric of how we operate right now. So let's actually define psychological trauma so that we can make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. Because frankly, when I first started this process, and I'm going back some years, I was working at the VA, and I think I had always been drawn to psychological trauma and treating traumatic conditions like PTSD and even personality disorders. It was because they were regarded as being treatable. And I would see that, yes, while people with PTSD or with some really traumatic experiences may struggle in some ways, many of them manage to not only take their traumatic experiences and survive them, but also to become triumphant in them, and in many ways use those experiences to help other people and make an impact in the world in their own way. When I began practicing medicine, and oh my gosh, now it's been almost 20 years that I've been in the medical field, and we did not think of psychological trauma as something that everyone experienced. And frankly, the medical community and the mental health community is just really starting to catch up to this concept that psychological trauma is a core experience that people have. And this is also why I'm literally the only trauma psychiatrist, because some years back I recognized the massive gap in our understanding of psychological trauma. And I felt that it was important for someone to fill that gap. So here I am, Dr. Alana, trauma psychiatrist. When I created the phrase trauma hurts, empathy heals, I wanted to quickly identify the problem and also provide the answer in as few words as possible. Trauma hurts, which is for darn sure. And empathy heals is my way of really communicating not only the problem, but also the solution in as few words as possible. Why is that important? Because we are in a time where there are so many painful experiences that are happening that we've become quite desensitized to those everyday slights and circumstances and pains. However, it doesn't mean that those experiences are not impacting our body, our brain, our psyche, and our spirit. The parts of us that we can't see are affected every day by this extremely painful society that we live in. So I want to give a definition for trauma that may not be the way that you've been taught to think about it. In fact, the way I had been taught to think about trauma was that there was a quote qualifying, that there had to be a qualifying event. And when we said qualifying, we usually thought of trauma as something that had to be pretty painful, if not obviously painful to the person doing the assessment. Certainly, the individual may identify it, but oftentimes they may not identify the experience as painful, but it would be obvious that this thing could be a major violation. So, of course, being at the VA, people have a tendency to think of combat and think of wars as being traumatizing, but we often don't really even give those experiences credit. I talked to many veterans who did not think that their traumatic experiences were traumatic enough because they would say, well, yeah, I was deployed, but I didn't have to do some of the things that I saw those other people do, or I didn't have the horror of the experience that this other person had, or in fact, a buddy of mine lost a leg or a limb or even their life. So I just had a non-physical experience of something. So how is it that that this is trauma. I mean, it was really interesting how many people really only counted the most extreme experiences as traumatizing. Well, even in my training, I think that we were taught to think of psychological trauma as a subset of conditions. In fact, we would do screening questions for depression, screening questions for anxiety, screening questions for bipolar affective disorder and mania, and even screening disorders for thought conditions like psychosis or hearing things and seeing things or being removed from the shared reality. But the trauma review of systems, which review of systems is a cluster of questions that helps to explore a particular type of condition. The trauma review of system was one that often was left off or was, kind of done as an afterthought. So for whatever reason, it just was never an afterthought for me. I remember several times finding myself wanting to know more and asking more and more questions as people would begin to tell me their traumatic experiences because I truly wanted to understand. And often I would find that people had very PTSD like clusters of symptoms for things that, would not have been counted on the quote qualifying list or would have gotten over that invisible bar that the mental health community has established in the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual or the psychiatry reference book that we use for what we consider official conditions. And people would have these cluster of symptoms, and I would listen to their thought processes about things like relationships and a painful relationship that or circumstance that happened, and they would be having flashbacks, repetitive thinking, avoidant behaviors, negative shifts in their thoughts and moods, body tuned up and hyperactive, and all those things still about this situation, but it wasn't a quote qualifying trauma. And it was in that space when I kept running into those scenarios that people would explain to me that were not in the books, in particular, racism. My veterans would sometimes tell me about stories that they'd shared with other providers, and I would read the provider's notes and I'd see their combat traumas, I'd see their natural disaster traumas. And what was interesting was that the traumas about racism and some of the other really damaging scenarios and stories that they told would not be listed in their charts. And it was almost as if we didn't have the language to really understand these experiences as legitimate trauma to the individual. And so I began to change the way that I thought about psychological trauma, and I would just allow the person to establish for me what they experienced as traumatic. And in doing so, it shifted my definition, and this is what I use. Any experience that is internally so negative that it changes the way you think about yourself, other people, and the rest of the world. I'll say it again. Experiences that are internally negative that change the way you think about yourself, other people, and the rest of the world. Now, that's not to say that those experiences are not sometimes externally and obviously experienced as negative, but I also wanted to identify the circumstances that also fit people that are so accustomed to traumatic experiences that happen in their day-to-day life, in their jobs, in their workplace, in their day-to-day experience, that they don't have the extreme reaction or the external turmoil that many people would have. I'm referencing many of our first responders, our law enforcement, our firefighters, our EMTs, healthcare workers, nurses, doctors, and all of the people who have to see the horrible side of humanity every day. I truly feel for our society right now because there's so many tragic things happen that you can't get bent out of shape about every horrible thing that you may see and every horrible thing that you may experience or go through. However, it doesn't mean that your body is not having an internally negative experience because of it. One of the things that I think is really important to do is to identify what experiences cause psychological trauma. Now, many people who have been around me will tell you that I will tell somebody in a heartbeat, like, I'm sorry, I do not want to hear your story. I'm sorry. No, I'm not sorry. I'm retired. I no longer see people one on one because I literally say and have to explain the exact same thing to everyone because our brain is all structured in the same way. So it matters not how you get your trauma, it's all leading to the same parts of your brain that are predictably programmed by these experiences. However, this episode is really about fleshing out the many, many things that lead to psychological trauma or that can be experienced traumatically. I want to also point out that for many of these experiences, someone can go through the exact same scenario. For example, let's start with a car accident. Someone can have the exact same scenario of a car accident, and one person walks away, maybe a little shaken up in the moment, but jumps back in the car. And, while they may be a little cautious for a while, they may be a little bit more alert, they would not necessarily have a response that changes a lot about their patterns, right? But then another person can have the same scenario and their brain becomes hyper focused on the experience and so tense and so anxious about the possibility of it happening again that it begins to feel like a much less safe experience to drive. And maybe that person can't go in that same area and begins to avoid that intersection or that highway. Maybe they begin to avoid going in that entire direction or even getting into the car. Maybe that person might even begin to feel like, I don't feel safe driving, and then lose their job or become stuck in their house because of their brain's response to that traumatic event. And I'm giving those two scenarios to make it clear that just because an event is traumatizing for one person, it doesn't mean that it would be traumatizing for another. And so I want to really be clear that all of these things that I'm listing, people may go through and they may not even realize that those things were damaging or may have affected them. So let's talk about some other things. We talked about car accidents, but also witnessing a motor vehicle accident can be traumatizing to people who are in the surrounding area. We have physical assault. So somebody putting their hands on another person, whether that is punching, hitting, kicking, or even touching inappropriately, physically violating another person's comfort zones, or physically putting your hands on someone and forcing them to do anything can be experienced as traumatic. Climate change. Climate disasters are becoming more and more common. I used to say natural disasters, which would include things like tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes and volcanoes and floods. And now we have so many unnatural disasters happening in part because our behaviors, human behaviors, are changing our environment so much that our weather is becoming more extreme. People are having wildfires. We're having windstorms. We're having typhoons. And we have glaciers melting. I could go on and on. We're having more avalanches. We're just having the Mother Nature is like, okay, y'all gonna keep playing. Mother Nature will exterminate you unless you evolve and change and grow and learn to exist in harmony with our environment. So we have these natural and unnatural disasters, but we also have sexual abuse. And sexual abuse can cover many ranges of behaviors. There can be being sexualized at an early age before you even understand what that is. This can be people making comments about your body, your private parts, or your development. This can be people exposing you to sex earlier than what your brain and body can handle, causing in some ways obsessive behaviors later on. This can be people touching you in inappropriate ways or causing you to touch them in inappropriate ways. This can be people going all the way to the point of violating your body or entering your body in ways that you do not understand, want, or desire. Sometimes it can be in the space of having a sexual relation that you may decide that you don't want to continue, and a person violate your will and violate your consent. All of those things are just some of the many examples of sexual abuse and sexually inappropriate behavior that can cause trauma. We also have racism. And racism comes in many forms and many shapes. We live in a society that has been based on a delusional concept of there being multiple human races and all of these differences that our society has made into what we consider now very real concepts like Black and white and Asian and Native American, which are ethnicities. They are not races. There is only one human race. However, that is not the way we think of things. So we learn discriminatory, racist stereotypes and assumptions at baseline that are harmful and damaging. And guess what? All human beings have these biases that are conditioned in us because of the exposure of our environment. Many of these biases we don't even know that we have until we explore the way our brain works and grow to understand it better. We have gender discrimination. You know, I look at the world today and it makes me so proud to see women doing so many roles that for so many years we thought that people couldn't do. And even seeing breakthroughs in all of these different ethnic communities. There's so many people who are the first Black woman to do this, or the first Hispanic man to hold that role, and so on and so forth. And truly, what it boils down to is that we've lived in an oppressive society that has made it clear to so many people for so long that we're not supposed to be in places and supposed to be able to do things. So we have created these biases that have been in place for hundreds and thousands of years that we're now breaking through and showing that those assumptions about what a woman can do and what a man can do, and that only one can do this and only the other can do that, are beliefs that have never been founded in reality. What they were founded in was the way that the society was designed at that time. So we have, once again, physical assault climate disasters, sexual abuse, racism, gender discrimination, sexism. We also have poverty. Having a lack of money and resources, and having been raised in environments that are full of lack of investment and deprivation, and people who are struggling and have to constantly experience the pain and humiliation of not having enough, and can visibly see that there is a world where people have not just enough, but way more than enough. That is a insult and a complex trauma that occurs again and again and again as people are faced with the cruelties of a world that allows such abject poverty, religious discrimination, political violence, cancer diagnosis, divorce, loss of a job or important role, failure at something important or a task, death of a loved one or the illness of a loved one, loss of expectations, loss of certainty, police violence and violence from government, especially as it relates to behaviors that harm communities and individuals, relationship and trust violations. These also are considered extraordinary traumas. I know I mentioned cancer earlier, but any medical illness where your body really goes out or betrays you in a sense, I think in many ways can be traumatic. I often have to tell people that you can't really experience something physically traumatic without experiencing trauma to the psyche. So often broken bones and other major health issues come along with painful experiences to your mind. Having mental illness in and of itself can be psychologically traumatizing, especially because of the stigma that our society still has about when people experience their brain doing something to their body that's hard to understand. The illness of a parent or a caregiver can be extraordinarily traumatic, especially when you see people that you may have looked up to in your life now needing you to step up or needing a helping hand and the roles shifting. Addictive behaviors can be traumatic, especially if parents or caregivers have addictions, whether it's to substances or to liquor and alcohol products, or to behaviors like gambling or being addicted to being in relationships and not focusing on their parenting. There's many, many spaces where caregivers being addicted to things that distract them become traumatic for the children that they're raising. Bullying. Bullying is so common, and bullying is not just in kids. We have bullying in our workplaces. Many of us experience bullying in school spaces, but the bullying doesn't just come from the other kids. Bullying can come from teachers and from mentors or other people that you look up to that may not believe in you the way that you would hope that they would. Bullying can come from colleagues at work or bosses. We have whole HR departments because we have some grown-ups who are big bullies. And unfortunately, the behavior of our biggest bullies is trickling down more and more into our classrooms and into the way that our children talk and think and interact with each other. Workplace harassment and intimidation can also be traumatic. Financial losses. Many people who experience major financial losses may have times where they feel devastated, even to the point where some people choose to end their lives because of what they believe is financial devastation. The pandemic put many people through financial stresses and other losses that they still may not have fully recovered from, and that also can create trauma. Competitive losses. You see many athletes, especially elite high performing athletes, that have come out recently discussing their experiences with mental health. And I'm so grateful that we're in a space where people are talking about these things now, because it is extremely important for us to humanize that even athletes have amygdalas, they have emotions, they feel things. You would too, if you were them. And it's important for us to normalize mental health for everyone, even high performers. Name calling and someone calling you out of your name, or someone referencing you in a way that you don't desire, can be an invisible trauma. Gun violence, individually and in communities. In fact, you can be secondarily traumatized, or that may not be the right term. Really, it would be tertiary trauma from reading and watching and looking at all of the traumatic stories in the news, especially those that connect most closely to you in your personal experience. Systematic oppression and policies and laws, slavery, and other forms of abuse that humans have visited upon each other for pretty much as long as our written history has existed. I really can't think of a time where humans have not traumatized each other over our differences, whether it was tribes battling each other over resources, or and empires and communities battling each other over the years, and then taking over other communities and traumatizing those people in a number of ways. So that once again brings me back to that blind spot that we have about trauma, because truly in our society, we have a tendency to want to act as if trauma doesn't exist. America in itself was founded in trauma, steeped in trauma. The foremothers and forefathers who came to America were being persecuted and traumatized in their homelands because of their belief systems. And then guess what they did? They brought that same behavior over here, and they brought it to the Native Americans and to the Africans that they enslaved, and brought those same cruel, harsh behaviors, thought processes, and removal from our own impact on each other. They brought that same callous thought process to the rest of the world. And while technology has grown and changed and connected us in new ways more than ever before, I think it has also connected us to the fact that we have not dealt with our traumas. We have bucket loads of trauma stuffed up in our corners, and we need to clean it out. That list that I gave you is not an exhaustive list of psychological trauma. It's just the things that I could think of off the top of my head when I went to record this podcast. The list could go on and on and on and on. But the important thing to remember is that it doesn't matter how you get your trauma. It's the same 6 parts of the brain that are predictably programmed by psychological trauma. And the good news is that no matter how you got there, you have this working prefrontal cortex, the most evolved part of your brain, right behind your forehead. Tap it, wake it up, boop, boop, reset yourself. Trauma is treatable. And that's my favorite part about psychological trauma. Trauma is programming. Trauma is what you learn to tell yourself in order to make sense of the world after you have these type of experiences. But the good news about something that can be programmed is that programming can be updated. So in closing, I ask you to consider updating the way you think about psychological trauma. It's not the boogeyman out in the woods. It is the core experience that is with all of us. I challenge you to broaden and stretch your understanding of mental health and to throw out the stigma of trauma, because what is the shame in having something that everyone has? There is no shame in having the experiences that every human being on earth is going to have. The important part is, what are you going to do to update your understanding of your own powerful brain and how it is affecting your body and your behavior? Well, that's all for today, folks. Trauma hurts, empathy heals. Our next episode will be diving into the case for why empathy is the cure for trauma and a whole lot of other things that's facing humanity right now. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a quick moment to give us a rating and even a review. We'd love to hear from you. You also can join me for our next 3-day live virtual event called The Trauma Cure, Creators Using Radical Empathy. And you can get more information about that at thetraumacure.com. All right, y'all. I want you to know you can heal.